And then I'm just gonna give, for those of you who don't know us here at Homebase, I'm just gonna do a quick uh 2 minute thing about Homebase. Homebase, we've been in existence for 35 years. So we have 35 years experience. We are a national technical assistance provider and trainer for HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Additionally, we engage directly with counties, cities, and COCs throughout the country each year to provide training and technical assistance. Some of you may know us and may think we're only in California. We are not. We are all over the country and we are everywhere. So how do we engage with communities across the country? We do this through a range of services which we tailor to your local landscape. We facilitate planning, analysis, and implementation to advance equity and translate these practices into reality and make and we do this through policy briefs and tools, cross-sector collaboration and partnerships, system building and strategic planning and facilitation, training, technical assistance, and capacity building. And then we also do data analysis and evaluation. So that's us in a nutshell. Again, my name is Karen Kowal. I'm a directing analyst here at Homebase. I've been here about 3.5 years. You will see some other folks on the call that are helping. If you see another Nora, Amanda, Patrick in the chat, those are all folks that are helping us out on behind the scenes. So don't be, they are supposed to be there. So I'm going to have our wonderful presenters introduce themselves. Mary, I'm going to start with you.
I'm Mary Simons. I'm a directing analyst here at Homebase. Before coming to Homebase, I was the executive director of a CoC agency that also did direct services. So I'm really excited to be here and talk about this topic.
And Nora.
The other Nora. We have the more Noras, the better philosophy here at Homebase. I am Nora Lally. I am located in lovely Cleveland, Ohio. I've been with Homebase about 5 years. Prior to that, I worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Most of that time was in the Chicago field office, working with amazing partners throughout the state of Illinois, and then was at HUD headquarters for a couple of years prior to that.
Thank you both. I also want to let people know, not only do you have a high level of expertise with Mary and Nora, they are exceptional human beings who really, I would say, for the homeless systems, care about the people experiencing homelessness and the people who are doing the work and who are leading the work in their community. So I've worked with them and they're just like wonderful people to work with. So you're going to have a great experience today with them. What we're going to talk about today, we've got 3 key topics. We're going to talk about best practices for financial management and workflow. We're going to do, they love compliance. So we're going to talk about complying with HUD regulations and other financial requirements. And then we're going to talk about managing specifically the continuum of care or COC grants and adapting budgets under challenging circumstances. So that's our 3 main areas today. And I am going to turn it over to Mary.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. So we're going to be talking about financial management and why this topic and why today. We know that a lot of you were surprised, just like we were in the events of the last week or so. And while people who do this work are very resilient, many of the people we heard from were concerned about cash flow and what's next. As we talked about it internally, we realized that surprises happen at other times as well. Sometimes at the national level, like COVID-19, the financial crisis of 2008, or periodic government shutdowns, but also at the local level, like maybe a finance manager who may be the only person to draw funds, suddenly has an emergency and the organization cannot make their draws, and it impacts cash flow. Or a board member who was the approving official rolls off the board and staff don't get certified to make draws, causing delays. These things happen and other things can happen too. And so that's why we're talking about being prepared and planning. Next slide. Through this presentation, we want to equip you all with the tools needed to stay ahead of crises. We'll be discussing what's possible within the existing regulations, how you can do the things, what rules apply, and what you should have in place. Of course, any changes to your policies and workflows are your decisions. And some of those decisions may need board approval, and some of those decisions might require through your own decision making to work with your field office partners in your implementation. So now I'm going to turn it over to Nora, and she is our one of our experts in the regulations that guide the CoC program.
Thank you, Mary. And I want to go ahead and let's get into it and start talking about some of the key elements for financial management, for your continuum of care grant, and then also the process and some of the issues around requests. This slide is my brain dump of things that I think are really important related to the financial management of a continuum of care grant. So I'll read off the labels and then talk about some of the specific items under those first. So some of the key elements, you have regulations, you have your grant documents, you have the electronic line of credit control system, affectionately known as ELOCs. You have your financial policies and procedures, and then there's also all within a philosophy of constant training and adjustment and evaluation. So regulations are really the backbone and the building blocks of what we do with federal funding. The ones that are most pertinent related to financial management are the Continuum of Care Interim Rule, the 24 CFR 578, and then the regulation that really is across the federal government about everything related to financial management, the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards, which is numbered as 2 CFR 200. And just to give everyone a notification that while I'm talking, I think there should be some of these things that as we talk about, if it's a tool or a specific link, you can look in the chat. And one of my colleagues, the other Nora, is adding those links to the chat. So the regulations are really, that's the answer book. If there's questions about like, can I, can't I, how do I, the most fundamental answer book is going to be the regulations. Not always super easy to read, not always really specific. So then we move on to what is a little bit more specific to your program. And that's where you get your grant documents. So the primary grant document is your grant agreement with HUD. That is the contract, it is the item that gets signed, it contains all the rules and regulations that you have to follow. It also has some other really important things that like clues to how you are keeping track of your grant. So the first thing that the grant agreement has is your period of performance. This is really the start and end date of the grant, meaning the start and end date of the funding that is eligible for this project. It'll contain the total amount of your award, and then it also contains different activity line items that you were funded for. So it has the total amount and then the amount for leasing and the amount for operating or the amount for supportive services. You've got your funding amounts by total and then by activity level. It also will have your grant number. This is a 15-digit number. It's going to start with the 2 initials of whatever state you're in. So for example, Illinois, those grants were all starting with IL and then continued on from there with various other numbers. Like this is really essentially your grant's fingerprint to HUD. So while you might internally know this project as some other more approachable name or some other, call it by, maybe it was named after someone, or maybe it's, whatever its name is within your system, know that the grant number is the way that HUD is always going to identify this grant. And then also that is the way that it is known within your financial and reporting systems. So the grant number is important. It's going to tell you lots and lots of information. ESNAPS doesn't actually spell out an acronym. It's just the application system for these projects. That's where other important grant documents are going to be your applications that you submitted to HUD for the projects. So you will have a current one application within eSnaps, and then if you've been funded for a really long time, or maybe even more than 1 year, there also was an original eSnaps application, which is instructive because the original eSnaps application is where you get more detail on the budget. So not just the total amount like for supportive services, but more of the line item costs of what you had budgeted to spend on those things. So the original eSnaps application is also really helpful. Your annual performance reports are helpful. They give you a good historical look, not just at activities that you undertook and outcomes for people who you housed and served, but it also gives you a financial look back at how much this project has spent of its awarded amount over the course of years. So those grant documents are all important documents related to understanding the financial picture of your projects. Another really important financial management element is that wonderful system, the electronic line of credit. See, rolls right off the tongue. The electronic line of credit control system, ELOCS. So ELOCS is essentially functions like to say simply, oh, it's HUD's ATM. That's how you go in and get your money from the HUD bank, and it is wire transferred into your organization's account. However, because it is a secure system, it is and a purposely intense and specific process in order to get access into the system, because all of the security process really happens at the front end of ELOCS, not on a per draw basis. So it's really important for your organization to understand the different roles and responsibilities. Who is the approving official? Who are the users? Those are specific roles within the system. So it's important to know who has those roles, and especially to know who is able to go into ELOCS to submit a draw. A lot of organizations, either over time or because of ebbs and flows in staff capacity, have really or because of the complexity of going through the security process, honestly, have really let it be that, oh, there's one person who has ELOCS person, and that's, that Karen does all our draws. She's our ELOCS person. She knows everything. That's really, like Mary said, that really can put you in a tenuous situation, either if Karen's gone for a really long time on a beautiful vacation and you need to get in to get your money and you can't do it because she was the only one who had access. So making sure that there's not just the ability to go into the system to do a draw, it doesn't just exist with one person, is a critical element. You can have, typically, between even 2 and 3 people who are aware of the financial process, are aware of your grant, who are aware of the eligible activities. So people who have an understanding of the grant and what's eligible, but make sure that you're not just leaving yourself in a situation where there's only one person who has access to do those draws. The system, through the grant agreement, HUD says you have to draw your funds at least quarterly. The system will allow you to actually do as many draws as once a day. Probably something that is more reasonable and helps with your cash flow is a monthly approach to doing vouchers. So now is a great time to look at what your organization's approach to doing vouchers through ELOCS has been. How often has it been? And if you have set up a structure where you are doing them quarterly, I think now is a really good time to revisit that and to think about, could we change our approach, and then could we change our policies and procedures to address that approach, to do more draws more frequently so that we keep the cash flow going. So keeping doing draws, do draws on a regular schedule, probably at least monthly, is an important critical element to know about ELOCs. Um, when you have different levels of users, there are all passwords, um, but these passwords expire. So it's really important to continue to go into the system so that you can maintain access. And it's also critical to maintain the security of the passwords. Um, we are on a limited time here, so I won't use all the never, never, nevers that I want to, but never, never share passwords. Passwords for ELOCs are specific to a person. They are tied to a social security number. They may not be shared. So that's why it's really, really important to make sure that you don't just have one person who has access to the system. Another critical element, like I, referenced, they always go together. Everything always comes back to your policies and procedures, and having clear policies and procedures that are specific about roles and responsibilities and timing, things we just talked about. Who are the users for ELOCs? Who are the approvers of vouchers? How does that process work? How often are we going to do that? Really a step-by-step, think of it, you can think of policies and procedures really as a to-do list. How are we going to do all of the things that we need to do to be able to determine what costs are eligible, to be able to verify that those costs were spent during our allowed period of performance, to be able to verify that we have supporting documentation that backs up the eligibility of those costs, and that we have the process to go into the system to do that. And do the policies that we have, not just are they clear, do they need to be changed? Is now a time when we could consider a change to our policies and procedures, maybe something like increasing the amount of time or the frequency with which you are doing your draws. The last thing I'll touch about related to this, like sort of financial management environments, is training. And then again, reiterate adjustments. So training is important because this is very, very complicated content, but it's not impossible. And there are a lot of training resources related to all of HUD's financial management responsibilities. Within this hour, we're really just like hitting the high notes. But there's a lot of resources where you can go more in depth into the training, and some of those are being shared in the chat. As far as who needs to be trained, we really encourage a broad level of knowledge. Financial staff and program staff being cross-trained can be a really important piece, not just to have a similar level of knowledge, but it can also really facilitate good conversations, especially about eligibility and documentation, record keeping, and involve some process improvements if everyone understands what needs to be done and any of the requirements around that. Training can also be really important for your board, for your other partners who know that you have this federal money, but probably don't have quite a window into all of the responsibility and administrative requirements that go along with it. So board training can also be critical. And then that can also be a piece that can help you make adjustments as needed over time. Next slide, Karen. So the real critical thing right now, today, now that you have this, like we set the stage with the financial management documents and requirements and all that fun stuff. So what I want you to think about today related to this, your CoC grants, is have we gone into ELOCs and reimbursed ourselves for all of the expenses that we have up until this point? Are we current on our draws from ELOCs to what we have expended? And we know that there's a lot of reasons why there can be a lag between funds spent for eligible activities and funds drawn from ELOCs. Sometimes that's what your policy is. Sometimes there have been staff turnover. Sometimes there's, it kind of gets to the point of like, I'll do that a different day. I have all these other things that I have to do right now. So it can go to the, I'll do that tomorrow pile. put it on top of your to-do today or tomorrow. Tomorrow, not like several tomorrows from now, like to go into the system and get current on your ELOCs requests. And if we can go to the next slide, if you're hearing these words feeling like, what? Oh, great, Nora, that sounds super. How on earth would I do that? If you're feeling like you don't really even know where to begin, we offer a little bit of an approach that you can take to determine whether or not you have that need to go in and do a request from ELOCs. So where do you start with knowing how much money that you've drawn from ELOCs? ELOCs is a good place to do that. Actually, it is not just the banking system that does the wire transfer. There's also a number of tabs in the system that enable you to get a good look at the current spending of your grant, and then also the spending of all of the other grants associated with this project. So there's a tab in ELOCs. I think it's the budget tab. So if you go into the budget tab, it will show you what was budgeted, which will be the amount on your grant agreement from HUD. And then it will also tell you, so you can compare what was, I think, authorized. Yeah, that's what it says in the screens. You'll see the amount authorized. Then you'll see the amount dispersed. So that will show you what you've already drawn. That will see any payments in process. So if payments have been done in the past couple days, you'll be able to see that. And then you'll see the balance. So starting in ELOCs is a really good way to be able to get a snapshot of where you are with your grants. You can also click into a couple different screens to get more specific information about them. So first you're going to go into ELOCs and get your current balances on your grants. Then you'll look at your records to compare, to calculate, hey, are we at the current amount? Does what we've drawn match what we know that we've spent on this grant already? And if it's not, then that's the time when you build your request for what you need to draw. So what that looks like is you pull together your reports, you pull together your records, you do the math to figure out, okay, what are our eligible costs and what is the supporting documentation? The time and activity reports, the invoices, the receipts for costs that we've spent. What is the amount that we need to draw from ELOCs, and what is the supporting documentation that verifies that those costs were eligible and that they were spent during our period of performance? So you build that out, and then you will go through your process of having those costs reviewed and approved. So someone within your organization will be verifying this. This is where it gets to a critical point in financial management, is also separation of duties, which is the idea that it's not one person can have control of a financial transaction from beginning to end. It's a checks and balances requirement, so that there's someone else looking at the materials to verify, yes, those were eligible expenses for this grant. Yes, they were spent during the time of the grant, and we have the supporting documentation to verify it. This is good, or maybe some of this is good, some of it's not. Sometimes this can be a little bit of a process back and forth, and that's okay. You want to make sure that you get it right so that all of the costs are eligible and have supporting documentation. So then you'll go in, the authorized user will submit the request into ELOCs. It generally takes, I don't know, I feel like 24-ish hours for the money to be wire transferred into the account that you set up with HUD. So it's a fairly quick turnaround of the funding into your account. And then you will file your documentation. So that is a quick step-by-step of what you can do if you know that you're not current on your ELOCs draws and you really want to get there and weren't quite sure how to get there. So that's a good starting place for that. I mentioned lots of other HUD and financial management requirements, which can be found in 24 CFR 578 or 2 CFR 200. And then Karen, if we go to the next one, I wanted to talk about a couple of the financial requirements that have really been, I'm going to say, hot topics of conversation in the past week, and that is the various methods of payment out of for the grants, and these are outlined in that 2 CFR 200. So the most common, probably most straightforward method of payment is the reimbursement method that mirrors the approach that I just walked through with you with that the blue squares to get your money from ELOC. So reimbursement is the idea that an organization incurs your eligible expenses, whether or not that's staff time, purchases, supplies, leases, whatever it is. You're doing something that is an eligible grant cost, then you pay for those expenses out of your own organizational resources. Then you do the review of the records to determine the eligible expenses for the continuum of care. You build that payment request and you verify it. You submit the ELOCS vouchers, and then you retain the records. So this is a method that will have a cost, and after you've already spent the funds, then you are reimbursing yourself. You are paying yourself back from the line of credit control system. This is pretty standard. It is in many ways encouraged by HUD because it is more straightforward and just is not quite as complicated as the other method, which we will talk about next, which is the advance payments method. You can tell that it's more complicated because we couldn't even figure out how to get it into a nice visual, and we're just relying on the words because the words matter. So I'm going to walk through the language because of the complexity of it. And I want to point out a couple key things related to the advance payment and how and when they can be done for your continuum of care grant. So as set out within 2 CFR 200, advance payments are allowable, but they must be limited to the minimum amount needed and timed to be in accordance with the immediate cash need. So this is basically saying, yes, you can take money in advance, but it should be not more than you need. It is only the amount that you need, and you should only take it within the shortest amount of time possible between when you can pay it back out. It's the idea that the federal system isn't designed to be able to do months and months of draws that then sit in organizations' bank accounts, and then they pay them out from there. It's meant to be on a money comes into the organization, but only for a very, very short amount of time, and then goes out to pay for expenses. Another critical element for doing advances is that your policy and procedures related to this have to be like spot on to explain and clarify how you are doing advance payments, but in a way that meets the federal standard that shows that the time of the time elapsed of the transfer of funds from ELOCs to payment is minimized, that the process and the method of payment, like, is it going to be a check? Is it going to be an electronic transfer of funds? The period that you're going to do the advance and the kind of activity that will be eligible. Say, for example, we're going to do advance payments for rental assistance. All of that stuff has to be specific within your policies and procedures. You also, in order to do this, your financial management system has to meet a certain level that is described in 2 CFR 200 as well. So your procedures should explain and verify that your financial management system is essentially up to the federal standard to be able to do this sort of advance payments. So an example of when advance payments are straightforward-ish for the continuum of care program is leasing and rental assistance payments. So You may make rental payments in advance of the rent due date, and you will you make your own determination about what the timing of that is and have that in your policies and procedures to get at the point of you can only draw as much as needed. Is that HUD limits that to 1 month of rent or leasing. So you can't pre-draw 5 months, 2 months, whatever. You can draw for 1 month of leasing or rental assistance at a time if your system is structured to do advance payments and you have all of those fun policies and procedures. Next. I shared this here. This is the question from the HUD monitoring exhibit, the HUD CPD Community Planning and Development Monitoring Handbook, Chapter 34, Exhibit 34-1. Can you tell I used to work for HUD? So this is the question about advance payments that is in a monitoring exhibit. So I just put this here. I'm not going to read through this one. But there's the question. It'll be in the slides that are posted. And then wanted to draw your attention to this third bullet here, which is on the exhibit that says, note, holding cash advances for a period longer than 3 business days is not a violation per se. It is a preliminary screening measure to determine whether further explanation is required. So I think a lot of us, if you've been doing this for a while, maybe you've heard of, oh, it's a 3-day rule, or you can't hold it for more than 3 days. There's some sort of like a common understanding that 3 days is a reasonable time. So I think this from the monitoring exhibit reinforces that, the idea that longer than 3 days needs a really clear justification, explanation. Your policies and procedures would have to explain why you were advancing the funds for longer than 3 days. Next slide. So if advance payments seem like, oh, hey, that's not something we typically do, maybe we want to consider working that into our policies and procedures. We want to kind of, add that to our financial management process. Some things that you can do now are draft a policy and use those requirements within 2 CFR 200 to draft something. Then check in with your accountant, your attorneys, check in with your people who have their own knowledge of federal regulations and accounting requirements to make any edits, improvements to the policy, train people on the policy, make sure program staff understand, financial staff understand, and then after you've got all those pieces in place, go ahead and do it. Next slide. Last slide I have on the financial management. I know this has been a lot of information, sort of a barrage of financial management terms, but wanted to highlight and give some other bullet points for what are really some of the common areas where HUD sees problems related to financial management. So this is a good checklist of places to make sure that you have these items and that they are really meeting the HUD standards. So the clear and current financial policies and procedures, clear, current, comprehensive program policies and procedures, especially if there's elements in there related to how much you're going to pay, when you're going to pay things, how much you're going to charge. A lot of program stuff is actually tied to financial stuff. They go hand in hand. So thinking about your program and financial policies and procedures hand in hand is a great way to think about it. Your financial records are important. Records pertaining to match is the either cash or in-kind elements that the program puts into the program. So you have to also have a clear methodology for tracking how the match was eligible, how it was documented that it was contributed, and clear policies for doing all of that. So match is another important area that ties to financial management. Audit requirements, if you are one of the larger organizations, and I think they just raised actually the standard for having to have a federal audit. I believe it's $1 million. So if you spend If your organization expends over $1 million in federal funds in a year, then you have to get the federally qualified audit to make sure that if that's you, that's something that you are current on. Other critical areas related to financial management are the time and activity reports that document staff time spent, especially when staff are working on multiple projects, to make sure that time is allocated appropriately across projects. And if costs are shared across projects, making sure there's policies and procedures related to how those costs are shared. I referenced the HUD monitoring exhibits, and I think the handbook chapter 34 is a great, really comprehensive way if you want to go through that to look at, do a little self-testing or self-monitoring related to financial matters, that can also be a great place to start. And I think that's it for me.
So thank you so much, Nora. We're going to talk a little bit about now, what do you do with all of that great knowledge? Managing your CoC grants and adapting the budgets. Next slide. On this slide, you can see that we're looking to the expertise of both the program team and the finance team as you're assembling your team and considering the management of the grants and the budgets. The program team does the work on the ground and provides some of the documentation needed for drawing funds. The delivery of the time and the activity sheets and information provided about services has a direct impact on when the finance team can actually make an accurate draw. The program team can provide insight into the program implementation that may impact budget line items. The finance team should be analyzing information provided by the program team on a regular basis to determine not only the current draw, but also the project's future budget needs. Next slide. Your team right now should do an immediate analysis. As Nora mentioned earlier, your team should ensure that all of your ELOCS draws are current. Make sure that you have a backup person to draw and that all people involved know their roles. Also, make sure your policies line up with your practices. Will you be doing advance payments? Will you be drawing weekly, monthly, quarterly, or some other plan? Some agencies draw twice a month in conjunction with their payroll and another draw for monthly rental assistance. Then they're always pretty much caught up on those big costs. Decide what works for you and make sure that the processes are in place for the source documentation to be available when the draw is done. The finance team and the program team should take a look at each of the CoC grants and review the period of performance. If the grant will expire before the renewal grant agreement is signed, what are your plans? Do you have funds to cover the gap? For how long? Where will the funds come from? If there will be a shortfall, a discussion of your board is important so that you together can make decisions about immediate funding gaps, as well as potentially working with the local field office for timing expectations and guidance. There are also resources through advocacy groups like the National Alliance to End Homelessness if issues related to this current issue persist. Next slide. When everything returns to normal, there should be a system of routine analysis. The program team and finance team should meet either monthly or quarterly, whatever works best for you, to review the actual expenses against the projected expenses and determine if some changes in the program need to be made, or determine if a budget revision may be needed, or maybe a line item move may be needed. These should be done periodically throughout the grant period so that you're not all at the end trying to catch up, but rather keeping an eye on these things during the whole period of performance. The team should be discussing these things regularly so that you can make appropriate actions. Next slide. Then the long-term analysis is really important. Review your funding mix. Do you have adequate funds outside of federal resources to run your programs? Remember ESG, CDBG, HOPWA, and other funds that may flow through your state, city, or county originate as federal dollars, so they can be impacted by federal activities. You should be looking at philanthropy options, either regional, national philanthropy, or local philanthropy, as well as opportunities for state and local general funds. This can happen with partnerships in your state and in your local areas. I know it's not easy, but make sure that local funders and state and local officials know about the work you're doing and its impact so they can support it. Also, agencies have been able to build reserves or recruit volunteers from the community during uncertain times by talking to their local Rotary Club or other service groups, partnering with the faith community. Look at anything that's available in your local area for the potential to diversify your funds. It will come in handy in these times. Next slide. Where to start? Really, we've given you a lot to think about. So where do you start? Gather your team, your staff, program staff, finance staff, your board. Look at what impacted the funding when there was a crisis. Look at your response. What worked and what didn't? It was a stressful time. So a lot of the responses were oh no. What was helpful? What wasn't? Were you current on your draws? If not, why not? And if not, is that something you can change for the next issue that may come up? What other financial challenges may remain? Create a plan to address the uncertainty of today and what may come. I think we'll go to questions.
Forgot how to unmute listening to both of you. So thank you, Mary and Nora, for that amazing presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We have gotten quite a few questions. Thank you all for your questions. I know we answered some of them. We typed the answer in if we knew them. And so I'm just going to go through some of these questions. I'm also going to say we got a lot of questions like, do you have a resource? I think that's a little bit of home-based homework, and we're going to see what resources we have. I'm going to use our time today to see if Nora and Mary just have some like hot tips or tricks that they've used to help with some of these things while we figure out some of the resource stuff for you. With everyone's favorite ELOCs, Nora or Mary, but I'm gonna start with you, Nora. Like, do you have any tips or tricks to like train or onboard folks about their ELOC's roles and processes? I mean, I know there's a lot of resources online, but like you've probably helped a lot of folks through this. Do you have any like hot tips for people to bring people into the ELOC's family?
Bring people, first of all, always call it the ELOC's family. I think what's important probably is to maybe look at those resources. There are some good webinars that will walk you through, or other resources in the chat. There was a resource, I think it's maybe the YHCP resource or startup or ELOC's training. So even if you don't get YHCP, the system, a lot of the things about getting access and those sorts of things are fundamentally the same. So find that, and then really get a little work group of people together to watch it, to ask questions, to really to understand it. And then you can write out your own like translation guide. Like, okay, this means this, or this is what this person is going to do. So almost do a real-time version of okay, I'm gonna like watch the video on how to do it, and then we're gonna stop and discuss within our own organization who's who, how are we gonna do it, think about what other problems might come up. So that's a thought on that. Mary, have anything else to shed light on that?
Well, that was a very complete answer, so I don't have a lot more to add. You did great. I'll just say that in the real world, things get busy. So just make sure that everyone is clear that nobody's going to take a shortcut, that someone is preparing the documentation, someone else is drawing the funds. When that voucher is created, it's printed out, and the director or the person who is responsible signs off that it was done correctly and that the source documentation and that voucher are filed together so that if HUD requires a review or something comes up, and for sure for monitoring, so that you have all of that source documentation. I know that most people file all of their financial records for the financial audit in one set of files. And my suggestion is to make a copy of all your source documentation so that stays clear, but that your source documentation is also filed with your voucher so that there's no confusion. You don't have to think 3 months from now, well, what did I mean by that? And where was that? And where do I find it? It's all right there. And Nora mentioned match. Have your source documentation for your match there too, so you're not having to look for it 2 years from now during a monitoring.
Mary, that's awesome. And that makes me think, so sometimes I feel like the concept of writing policies and procedures feels so daunting, people don't do it because you feel like it has to be either in this very formal way or in a very formal language. I always feel like, and when I was a HUD monitor, I would say, I was an English major. Explain this to me like an English major. Like it should be very clear. It doesn't have to be. And in fact, sometimes the wordier it is or the more confusing it is, it's not useful. So it should be useful. So make sure things are useful. Don't worry so much about any kind of formality to them. If writing them feels different, there's a lot even of technology like talk to text or use like different kinds of things that are available if you feel like, oh, we know how to do it. There's a couple scenarios that are really bad. One is we don't have any policies and procedures. One is, oh, we have them. Let me pull the binder off the shelf, dust it off. Here you go. Or, oh, we have it, but that's not really how we do it. If any of those three things are how you feel like your organization is functioning related to policies and procedures, especially financial management, now's a really good time to revisit it and really get to that level of clarity of function and responsibility.
Great. Thank you both. So, Nora, I'm going to come back to you. There's a lot of interest in advance draws, advance payments. I think that's not surprising. Questions just come up about like best practices for advance draws. Like, we have a lot of folks that are I was thinking about this and related to drawing funds for rental assistance or master lease payments in advance, like doing those in advance and not retroactively. Like, you all have some like best practices that you for advanced draws in that way, if it seems the most typical way that we do it.
Yeah, definitely the leasing and the rental assistance are the uh, easiest to understand. I can understand why the rent is due on the first of the month, so I'm going to draw the funds for the rent a few days before so that the cash will be there and I can make the payment on time. So I think if you take a similar approach when you're thinking about it, like, well, what other costs do I have that it's going to make sense for me to draw the money in advance and then have it on hand for the shortest amount of time possible and then to pay it out. So I think the logic of leasing and rental assistance is a good place to start. And then think about if there's other costs that seem really obviously like, oh, that's similar, we could do it there. I feel like if you're having to stretch within your brain to make the justification or to like try to think how it would work, it's probably not a great fit for advance payments.
And Nora, I was just saying, like, when I was working in the field, I think like with the rapid housing, we kind of like looked 2 weeks before the end of the month to see like how many units do we have, who are we paying rent for, and then kind of like start the process, confirm where we are with the program with enrollment, and then get that kind of advance payment moving right well in advance to make sure the landlords get things on the day. Just a like quick follow-up. Are there any limits to the number of advances you can do or you're eligible for?
Um, the limit would be meeting those standards of having the financial system, of having the written policies and procedures, and having the justification. So it's not so much a number or even an amount. It's more like, is the situation appropriate for it? Is your financial system structured to support it? And do you have it all contained in your financial policies and procedures?
Mary, I'm going to direct this one to you. We had a question that folks are interested in. Can you provide any resources or suggestions around how to diversify revenue to sustain services? So I think that's a perennial question, right? Too, not just in uncertain times.
Yes, it is a long-term planning process. It really is about developing those relationships, developing the relationships with your city council or county commissioners, develop and letting them know what your needs are, letting them know what works. One organization I'm familiar with in my state was able to work with their state legislator, and somehow, some way that I don't know all the rules, but it just goes to show you so that sometimes there's extra things that we don't always know about. But they let the state legislator know about their impact, and then there was actually a state rule that allowed them to work in partnership with the state legislature to have part of the state revenue from state taxes go directly to that program. And it's kind of complex, but I'm only using it as an example that there may be things in your state or your city that are not widely known, but as you're developing that partnership, can benefit your program. Also, I mentioned the presenting to the Rotary or any other service clubs, the Elks Club, others. They oftentimes will have fundraisers through their membership. Also, saving money is also good because if you work with a church group and they're providing things like a welcome basket for each of the people that you're moving into housing, you may be working with several church organizations and they're providing 200 baskets. And that means every single person gets this basket. That's saving you money that you don't have to spend, where you can then hopefully some of the other monies that come through philanthropy or United Way or your foundation, your local community foundation, those can go into reserves. So just getting those partnerships and community support. It's a long-term process, but it really is getting your name out there, getting your impact out there so people can support you.
Great. See where to go now. A lot of great questions. Again, like we'll check and see if we have resources on some of these things, but folks were interested in resources on tracking time and activity. It's a question always in people's minds. HUD resources aren't the best. Like any tips or like things you've seen that have really worked well with that, or ways to do it that are helpful for folks for today, and look and see where that, I know that's always a question whenever you're getting like monitored or audited, right?
I think we can provide some of that on the landing page.
Yeah.
There are some software products out there that people use that that a lot of people have been very happy with. There are also some organizations, some of the larger organizations work with an HR company who also has some sort of automated system for that. And of course, if we use the resources that are generally provided through the HUD Exchange, a spreadsheet works just as well, as long as we're looking at, what is the amount of time and what was somebody doing and was that something eligible? And so it's just really a matter of tracking it in a way that makes sense for your organization.
Great. Trying to see what the next hot topic that we had a lot of questions about. This might be the last one. I'm gonna start with it's not super popular, but like budget. We mentioned budget modifications and revisions. Briefly, like just general, like is there a limit on how many budget revisions you can do with your HUD award? Like, are there any, like, again, tips or resources on submitting them, like what the HUD wants to hear when you're doing a budget modification or revision?
I'll defer to Nora because my rule of thumb was the fewer the better.
Yeah, and I think that this is like the language gets complicated too because there's a difference between a budget revision and an amendment, or the language it's changed. Sometimes it's minor change or major change, which basically a change of moving 10% or less from one budget line item to another is something that you can do within the course of business. You don't need HUD approval to do it. You need to inform them because they actually have to go into that ELOCS, into the electronic line of credit control system, and change where the money is distributed. So you have to let them know, but they don't have to approve it. But those changes are cumulative. So if you're making a bunch of tiny little budget modifications up to the point where they equal more than 10%, then that's when it is a higher threshold of review by HUD and it requires a grant amendment where you have to typically tell HUD, hey, this is the change that we want to make. Most of them are financial, but there's other amendments you can make to your grant and really justify what the need for the change. HUD offices, field offices are very, very short staffed. So some of them have their own policies about how far out before the grant expires you have to request the amendment. So a good practice is to do like at that review point, maybe like a 6-month review, look at your spending, look at if you have had maybe some staff positions that have been vacant, so you're able to move money to other things, or do that kind of analysis, probably like the midterm of your grant. And then if it is a minor change, 10% or less from one line item to another, you can let HUD know you're going to make the change. If it's more than that, you can request an amendment and explain why the change is necessary.
Okay. Yeah, yes, we could do a whole section on budget amendments, so revisions. Anyways, whatever we call it. So I put the slide up. We're gonna do an FAQ. We're gonna look at the questions we didn't get to and see if we can answer some of them. We again put resources on our website. The one thing on the left, you're gonna see contact us with follow-up questions. I don't know about you all. Sometimes my question doesn't come to me till the day after or 3 days after. So please reach out to us if you have questions in the future. We also want to collect those just to understand what like the next phase of this would be and what you want to hear about. So the slides are on our resource page for financial management. We're gonna put all those great links that we shared in the chat. If you weren't able to copy and download those will be on the resource page too. And we just have a real quick poll for you before the end of the day. Thank you so much for everyone who's visiting with us for the end of their day, taking time in the middle of their day to hear this webinar. We appreciate you all so much. You all do amazing work. Please keep it up. We are with you, and we hope to be with you again soon. Thank you.